Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jody Kilbasa. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's Festival's Beyond the Screen virtual discussion of the documentary film Beastie Boys Story. Before we start this afternoon's discussion, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge the tragic death of George Floyd and the protests that have erupted across our country and the world. Earlier this morning, the Virginia Film Festival posted a statement in support of those protests calling for justice in the murder of George Floyd. I'd like to take just a moment to read it. We believe that Black Lives Matter. We stand in solidarity with the protests across the world and demand justice for the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. And we stand against the abhorrent racism and violence against the Black community and people of color that continues to pervade our country. We're committed to furthering and expanding the ways in which the Virginia Film Festival offers a platform for Black voices, artists of color, and diverse points of view through our programming. Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. Jack Hamilton, UVA Assistant Professor of America Studies and Media Studies and a pop critic for Slate. He's a cultural historian who studies sound, media, and popular culture, and his other areas of interest include film, sports, television, and journalism. Since 2013, he has also been the pop critic for Slate magazine, where he writes about music, sports, and other areas of culture. And in 2016, he hosted the Slate podcast series, Pop, Race in the 60s. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, NPR, ESPN, Transition, the LA Review of Books, and many other venues. A.D. Carson is an assistant professor of hip hop and the Global South at the University of Virginia. He received his PhD in rhetorics, communication, and information design at Clemson University, doing work that focuses on race, literature, history, and rhetorical performances, and is also an award-winning artist. His dissertation, Owning My Masters, The Rhetorics of Rhymes and Revolutions, is a digital archive that features a 34-track rap album and was recognized by the Graduate Student Government as the 2017 Outstanding Dissertation. Colin Wade is the director of Nine Pillars Hip-Hop Cultural Festival. Colin Wade is an educator, rapper, promoter, and writer based in Charlottesville, Virginia. He's the co-founder and director of the Nine Pillars Hip-Hop Cultural Fest, co-host of the Arts and Crafts Film Podcast, and teaches audio and video production at Monticello High School. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today, and now I'll turn it over to you.
Peace.
Yeah, thanks for having me and us.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, thanks, Jody. I'm happy to be here. I guess I would like to say, to add just on what you were saying at the beginning, it does feel a little odd to sit here, for the next half hour, 45 minutes and discuss this documentary about a white hip hop group in the context of everything that's happening in the country. But what I was thinking about is just sort of, I think, in the spirit of the Beastie Boys, like the Beastie Boys, I think what they would first and foremost want acknowledged is that, as a hip hop group, like hip hop is fundamentally Black culture, and, to enjoy Black culture, I think Americans have for a long time placed a greater value on their own enjoyment of Black art and Black culture than they have placed on the lives of the people who've made that culture. So if you're watching this movie and you enjoy or you're watching this video right now, you enjoy the Beastie Boys music, which I'm guessing that's one reason you're watching this. I would just encourage you when you're done to do what you can to help the protesters and stop police brutality, whether that's making a donation or organizing or really whatever you can do.
Yeah, or having uncomfortable conversations with your grandma.
Your grandma or anybody's grandma, actually. I mean, I would say that, I guess we can dive right into it because you said it feels odd to be discussing a film like this in this context of what's going on right now around the country. But there's certainly a lot that we can talk about from the film. You say that the Beastie Boys would want to first and foremost acknowledge that they're guests in a culture. I wish the film had done more to address race, and especially in some of the stories they told about the wild old days, when they were on Def Jam and the touring, and getting thrown out of Great Britain, and all the fun, like the fun rock star stories they told. I wish they had done more to address how the push and pull of their proximity to Blackness, and how that might have affected the way they were received on either end of the spectrum, positive or negative. We can't ignore the fact that as white boys, they probably got away with a lot that artists of color in their same position would not have. They would have had to conduct themselves a lot more mindfully.
Yeah, I think that also makes me think of, I mean, I'd been considering this exact same thing watching, that there's a clip of LL Cool J talking about the Beastie Boys and saying how hard they were making it for him to, or for artists like him to tour, because the way that they would wild out whenever they were, wherever they were. Of course, like this kind of thing then gets taken out on, folks like LL and, Black folks.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, I think that it seemed, it was peculiar. And I think, as Cullen said, I would like to have seen a little more about that, because I'm always interested, honestly, when, when I have a lot of students who are white guys who want to be rappers. And my question is a question like the statement you made earlier, Jack, is that how do you see yourself in relation to the culture in which you're participating? And while it's really cool to assume that it is an ethical relationship, or that you're considerate of what it means to other people and really what it means. I know, like that moment where they talk about how Russell wanted a white boy rap group and it didn't matter who they were, which seems like, yeah, okay, cool. What does it mean for it to be you? Like, what does it mean to you for that to be you? And I think that means a whole lot to us. And I mean, I don't know necessarily about me. I have my thoughts about it. But what I really always want is for that audience that is going to use the Beastie Boys as a way to evade the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
If they have the conversation, then their audience is going to have the conversation. Because then we started off talking about this, but I imagine the number of conversations about this film that are never going to mention that, because it never really gets mentioned in any explicit way. And they don't reflect on it in any way to make us think that there were any issues other than the fact that they felt used by Russell Simmons for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And that is something, it was striking to me too, that the documentary didn't sort of confront race more sort of head on, or really, yeah, sort of sometimes even at all. Which is particularly interesting because this movie is based on the book that they wrote, the two surviving guys, Mike D and Ad Rock wrote, that came out a couple of years ago, that actually goes into like quite a bit of depth of that. And they talk a lot, and with real sort of reflection about what it meant for them, to be sort of, as you mentioned, Cullen, kind of guests within this culture. And what it was, their proximity to artists like Run DMC, who they absolutely idolized and were friends with, and then suddenly they were more successful than. And it's interesting too, because you bring up, like the issue of like sort of, because I feel that in many ways, like the sort of next generation Beastie Boys figure is Eminem, and I find the way that some people talk about Eminem's music is this sort of taken for grantedness, that this is a guy like that. It's like, oh, he's a great rapper, so therefore, like falling back on this very sort of simplistic idea of sort of color blindness within the music, which I think, Eminem also, for all of the, the very many sort of problems with Eminem, has always been fairly conscientious about, his own position as a white rapper. And it's something that he has, confronted at times in his music and in interviews and things like that. But yeah, I agree that it was a sort of odd absence within the film to not have that talked about more. And again, like, yeah, outside of them sort of making that comment about like Russell wanted to, you know, saw them as like, you know, oh, if I, you know, like if I had white rappers will make me, you know, make me rich, which they did. But like, yeah, like their own sort of complicity in that is like something that I think could have been gone into more.
Well, I think there's a few different things happening. One, their presence at or very near the birth of hip hop culture, or at least the explosion in the global awareness of hip hop culture, sort of grandfathered them in, I think, a little bit in their minds. And the fact that they were accepted so early. But that, I don't think that, and it's interesting you say that they go into more depth about it in the book. I haven't read the book. Certainly the opportunity to speak to that in a film which is necessarily going to have a wider audience than the book. You're not going to pick up the book unless you are already a Beastie Boys fan. It's entirely possible that somebody who's less familiar with them, or who might even just be a Spike Jonze fan and wants to see Spike's latest film, is going to come in with a, you know, a limited amount of knowledge, and would, as AD said, by avoiding that conversation, it sort of gives them license to avoid that conversation in the larger discourse. As a white rapper, I'm here representing the Caucasoid contingent of MCs. I have always been extremely mindful of the necessity of pointing out that I'm a guest in the culture, and mindful that when I go into white spaces as a hip hopper, I'm representing a culture that is not mine. For instance, when the Beastie Boys were going overseas, you know, like AD alluded to, it made it that much harder for Black artists. You know, this might be the first exposure that a global crowd has to American hip hop in person. There's a great responsibility that comes with that. And I've always been extremely critical of white rappers who do not explicitly, you know, my point of view has always been, a Black rapper is political by nature because existing and thriving as a Black person is a political act. A white rapper cannot afford to be apolitical, and to be apolitical is to, as a white rapper, is to side with the status quo and to sort of abuse the relationship that you have with hip hop. I would never tell Ad Rock or Mike D to their faces that they were that they were traitors to the culture, but I think their silence in the film speaks volumes.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I do think there's an aspect that, like, I mean, and this is something that, like, you know, there's, I feel like in many ways, the Beastie Boys has sort of spent their entire careers after License to Ill, and like sort of what it brought them, kind of trying to really drastically distance themselves from that. Like, I know for a fact that for many years, they wouldn't perform any songs from that album live. And, you know, certainly it was something that, like, as they, you know, that's one of the things that I think is sort of interesting about the movie, is like seeing this sort of journey that this group takes, you know, to being, you know, more like, you know, much more politically engaged. I would say in the 90s, like, in terms of, you know, as someone who was growing up around then, like the Beastie Boys were, you know, among like sort of major pop groups, were probably like more on the political side than a lot of their contemporaries, like just within popular music more broadly, not necessarily within hip hop, but, you know, certainly like, you know, causes like the Tibetan Freedom Concert and things like that. And certainly, you know, and having, you know, a record label where they really like sort of boosted up artists that people, you know, were not, that would have been sort of otherwise kind of marginalized and things like that. So yeah, like I think so that might be, I think maybe part of it is like this sort of sense that, you know, on their side, they're like, oh, I mean, one thing I was struck by in the movie was how much they talked about License to Ill, because like usually they don't it's not something they talk very much about, you know, even in the book. So first of all, the book, by the way, is like 600 pages long. So you're absolutely right that no one is going to read it that's not already a Beastie Boys fan. But in the book, they spend like 3 pages on License to Ill. Like, they're just like, this is like, yeah, that happened. And like, then we like, you know, whereas the movie spent a lot more time on it. But yeah, I mean, I wonder if that was maybe one of the flaws in the way that the film was put together, was like not actually, them sort of like kind of gliding over the sort of like profound shift that they sort of take in terms of their orientation. I definitely think within hip hop too, that like it was the Beastie Boys later music. Even though there's definitely some people were into License to Ill. I mean, I know, like, I've heard Chuck D speak like incredibly effusively about License to Ill, particularly the production and how much it sort of influenced, which wasn't them. I mean, I think Rick Rubin produced most of that record, but but then certainly, you know, with their later work, you know, it's more with stuff after License to Ill that I do feel like they start being taken, you know, more kind of seriously artistically within the community. I don't know. I guess that's not really a question, but I'm wondering what you guys sort of think about that.
Yeah, this is gonna be me sounding like a hater.
Please do.
This is probably what I do best. But I think that I think this is one of these things, like the presence of the thing, like, or where I want to say it's Mike D's talking about like the moment that he starts to feel like a real musician.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, it feels almost like it reveals something that he feels about rappers.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, because like if at the moment that you say like now we're a real band and we're playing our instruments and we went out and we did like this real tour and we like really practiced because we got good at playing instruments.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to also be a statement not just about oneself, but a statement about like the genres within which you find yourself performing. And so then there's like at that moment it's like, yo, like friendly fire, and it's not even really that friendly because you know, like it's hella people that they came up with who never picked up an instrument and you know continue to produce. And I understand how that's not what he said. But it's also, you know, nonetheless what I heard. And yeah, I don't know, like that's, and I don't think that's not a criticism of the Beastie Boys. I think that's just like, it's a takeaway where, you know, artists, and certainly it happens with groups like The Roots, where you're a band and somehow being a band then separates you from rap groups that don't play instruments or don't play the instruments that you play, and then you get taken more seriously because of that, or because of the ways that you seem to like not. It's, you know, similar to the way that like I, as a guy who teaches where I teach and what I teach, have to constantly remind people I'm a rapper. And you're not saving me from something by saying that I'm something else, by telling me that I'm a professor, or by telling me that I'm like a poet. None of those things really help me, and all of them are insulting, because like if my identity is as a rapper who works at a university and teaches where I teach, then I don't need you to help me with that, you know, like with that title. And I think that like rappers end up taking the you know, like this, what I'm calling friendly fire, whenever that happens at that moment in the film, and maybe in our imaginations when we talk about groups who evolve from just being rappers into, you know, like the fully formed musicians, you know, apparently they become once they, you know, stop rapping to, you know, 808 tracks.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think the fact that the Beastie Boys came from the punk world, and being, you know, I'm a hip hopper. I was also a punk kid. I always said that my favorite Beastie Boys recording was Pollywog Stew, the only hardcore, the only punk album that they put out, which is out of print now, and they've done a little bit to sort of distance themselves from. I think that's the most pleasant listen of any recorded project that they've done. there's a certain amount of pride in not being a good musician that comes into play in the punk world. It's sort of, I guess you could interpret that statement by Mike D in two ways, as an embrace of hip hop as more musical than punk. Just to, I don't think that's what he was saying, but it is interesting because in the punk world, there's a kind of curated authenticity that a lot of punk rockers take pride in. If I were better at my instrument, I wouldn't be punk anymore. So it's kind of, it ends up simultaneously being a rejection of hip hop as a musical or anti-musical, and also a rejection of punk as being the same thing. And I think that extends to the form of the film as well, that mediated authenticity of like, oh, they left in the fuck ups, they left in the part where the drop was supposed to happen and didn't. But at the same time, it's clear how heavily edited and produced the film is. So you have this illusory spontaneity, and like I said, mediated, kind of authenticity and rough around the edgesness, which is more of an illusion, which I think is interesting for a group like them that exists at the intersection of punk and hip hop. It's sort of, Spike Jonze came out of skate culture too, which has that as well. You leave in, you don't, when you're making a skate video, you don't just show the tricks that they land, you leave in some of the falls to break it up. But it's all very, these guys are multimillionaires. It's, they benefit from being perceived as in some way incompetent. It's part of their brand, which I think is interesting, which is also kind of a function of whiteness as well. That meme that says, carry yourself with the confidence of a mediocre white man. They can afford to be loosey-goosey.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys what you thought of the format of the film. Is sort of interesting. Like, it's been billed, it's been described as a live documentary, I think. At least that's what it says in like the promotional materials. Yeah, and it's like this sort of with this like two-person show basically, and then turn it into this movie that's got like, one thing that's interesting about this film is that I think it was originally intended to be, it was going to be shown on IMAX prior to the pandemic. That was like originally how it was going to be released, which I'm guessing was to try to sort of recreate like the sort of in-person aspect for film goers. But yeah, I'm sort of like, I haven't seen many movies that take that particular format, particularly music documentaries, which is one of the weird things about this film. Like, for a documentary about a group that is famous for music, like there's actually not all that much music in the movie, I feel like. But yeah, I was wondering what your guys' sort of thoughts were on the format. I guess, Cullen, you just touched on it and stuff, but whether you thought it, worked, didn't work, or, pros, cons, whatever.
Well, I thought that it was cool, but it did, for a good portion of it, it felt like the TED Talk on how we accidentally became rap stars.
Yeah.
And it felt that way, in the entire production really felt like, we're going to take the TED, we're going to deconstruct the TED Talk and then make a music documentary out of it. And there's going to be an audience there that's going to be able to see us do, to kind of like recreate the magic. The energy that we had whenever we were together is going to come across here on stage. And so I think that my saying that is not a criticism of the film. Like, I think that is the part, like that's what works about it for me, is that it feels very much like that. Like we lucked up and became rap stars and we didn't know what to do with it. We fucked up a lot along the way. But we tried to reconcile some of it, and, like we lost a really good friend. And all of those things are things that draw me into the film. For a person who is not, I'm not a or never have I been like a huge Beastie Boys fan. This film provides a space for me to like kind of get an intimate look at what they do, what they did that I would not otherwise have gotten. And if it was a more traditional film, I don't think that I would have been as impressed by what they had to say about, you know, like their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, with the exception of what I mentioned about race earlier, I mean, I think it's really important that they acknowledge the frat dudeness of their, you know, like, you know, the early years, the way that they treated the previous bandmate, and the way that they attempted to reconcile that, the way that they even tried to speak out against misogyny, you know, like later on. And I mean, again, it's I don't know if there's like a low bar. And I think that there does exist quite a low bar in these kinds of spaces where like a dude is like, don't be shitty to women. And then everybody's like, oh, like the feminist manifesto of the Beastie Boys. Still, the form works. That's all I wanted to say there.
Yeah.
No, I think that's an important thing to note, that you can make a whole album full of, you know, blatant misogyny, and then a few years later come out and say, actually, you should respect women, and that's seen as it's seen as a sufficient corrective. Again, I mean, I don't want to keep bringing it back to the, you know, to the whiteness, but like AD said, there's a low bar. That bar is not necessarily, it would not necessarily be in the same place for a black rapper, let's say like an Ice Cube, who still has to dodge misogyny charges, no matter how much a champion of women he's been in the last, what, 2 decades?
Yeah.
And of black women particularly, I should add.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what AD was saying. I think like I thought the movie worked best as a sort of when it was like on a kind of personal level. Like I did find the stuff like their discussion of, you know, the loss of Adam Yauch to be really moving, you know, even though there was, I totally agree with you, Colin, that there's a sort of canned authenticity to this format, and like the way that like, yeah, it's a little overly clever, the way that what they sort of choose to leave in and choose to leave out, which is sort of, you know, it's sort of sometimes a tendency of Spike Jonze's filmmaking. But yeah, I mean, that was like the sort of discussion, the sort of ruminations on friendship, I think were in many ways the sort of the parts of the film that worked well. I definitely thought that one thing I don't usually, it's such a cliche of music documentaries to just have like a lot of like talking heads, you know, just get like a bunch, like for like, you just get a bunch of the artists, like famous friends and like, you know, people who they've encountered together to talk about them. I honestly wished with this documentary there was like a little bit more of that, because I was kind of like, I actually now want to hear from all of these people who, you know, if you're in the music industry for as long as they've been, they've crossed paths with like an incredible amount of people. And like, yeah, I sort of wanted to hear a little bit more from others, which obviously the format of this film kind of precludes until like the sort of the very end, when there's like the famous people start showing up and it's just kind of like goofy and stuff.
Those credits bit.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually, oh wow, my phone is ringing. That is it.
I was worried about mine.
I felt the opposite. I thought it was an interesting approach to music documentary, kind of reminiscent of like Errol Morris, Fog of War, having just one interview subject. It gave it a certain internality where, you know, I don't necessarily, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it for those reasons, I think. I could poke a lot of holes in that, but it felt refreshingly internal to me.
Yeah, I think that this is also, you know, that like perhaps it leaves room for that documentary to be made. You know, I want to hear what Kate Schellenbach has to say about being dismissed from a group and then like coming back, because like we can always like, I think that we can always have like the people who are in the power position talking about like the ways that they wielded power when they had it and how fucked up it is that we did that, but like we're sorry, and then we, you know, like we mended it. It's different than being that person and saying like, well, here's how I felt after that, and here's what I did with what I felt. And so like that was one point, but I really do appreciate that last part of the film where they do talk about MCA, and there's the friendship is like, I think their friendship is most on display there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that maybe that's the thing that you don't get that much from films like this, where you see that the people who work with each other are really invested in the lives of their, you know, like their bandmates who are their friends as well. I really appreciated that, and I don't know if that would be presented, you know, like, or if that would come across in a more traditional type of documentary. I mean, even because I couldn't imagine talking about my dead homies, like I couldn't imagine talking about my dead friends to a group full of people, you know, like night after night.
Mm.
And them not being able to be there, even if, you know, like a full, you know, a packed house, and I'm like, yo, like this person is not here, and I'm having to go through this each night. That's tough. I mean, and you see that it's tough in the film. I can't imagine what the other takes. I mean, I'm assuming that they did this multiple times, you know, but I'm assuming, I don't know what that must have been like to have to go through that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. I appreciated that. Even, I mean, it's a weird thing to know that you're going to film that and then show it to people.
Yeah, totally.
But watching it, it still is, it's a bit moving, because like that is the most significant absence, you know, as well as the most significant presence, you know, at the end of the film.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that struck me watching this movie is like one of the things that allows for, I think it's like, to have this interesting format is that like most band documentaries, it's like most bands hit a point where like everyone hates each other. Yeah. So, you know, you can't get like, I mean, you think about like just, you know, another rap documentary, like in the, you know, the AD you and I were, you know, did that thing with last year, where it's like, it's more a movie about like a Tribe Called Quest kind of like falling apart, you know, and then in Q-Tip and Fife, like not getting along, and sort of this sort of like, you know, trying to hold it together. And I think that's often, you know, like most music documentaries are based around that tension, you know, like it's like that sort of like what, you know, the breakup story, you know, I think about all those like VH1, like behind the music things, and it's all just about like people who can't stand each other. And that's, like a sort of interesting wrinkle in the Beastie Boys story is that like they didn't apparently really ever go that route, and sort of were people who did sort of continue to like actually enjoy being in each other's company, which is, I think, unusual in a group that's been together that long.
Yeah, it's a silent, it's almost like the silent majority of bandmates that still really like each other, but it's a story that nobody wants to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's like, yeah, the conflict is like the interesting story usually behind bands. It's
Right.
like, who hates you?
I don't necessarily know if that's a majority, but it feels right to me. I still love everybody I've ever made music with, regardless of the vicissitudes that come into play.
Mm-hmm. So I think we're now supposed to transfer this into the Q&A section, which I think we're going to do for about 10 minutes. So thank you guys both for this conversation, and I'm being sort of fed some questions from the crowd, and thank you everyone who's joined us for this. So I'll just read this first question, and if you guys want to answer it, or you know, if one of you wants to sort of talk on it, or both of you, whatever. So the question is, how do you feel about the concept that the film addressed their offensive misogynistic issues very directly, but the Beasties are idyllically almost transcending race? so why go there? Like, why is there like, you know, like, I guess maybe like the film does seem to focus quite a bit on the more sort of flattering story of their sort of conversion from, you know, being aggressively misogynist to being, I guess, less aggressively misogynist. But, you know, that the film doesn't really address race as directly as it addresses sexism, basically.
I would take issue with the wording of idyllically transcending race. Is it possible to transcend race? And if it were possible, why would that be an ideal?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of implicit colorblindness in that question that we probably don't want to spend all the time to unpack. But that's the sort of thing that these people on my shirt say.
Well, I think the question was more about that. I think my understanding of the question is that it's like more the film is presenting it that way. I sort of read that as being maybe kind of ironic, the idyllic transcendence thing.
Yeah, and I think that this is the, you know, like an issue that you see presented sometimes when folks operate with the assumption that, you know, if folks operate with the assumption that you know, I'm good on this, you know, on this account, so we don't really have to bring that up, then it does become an issue for lots of viewers. I mean, like, if I wanted to use this, I couldn't use this film, or I wouldn't use this film in class if I'm talking to students who don't know the Beastie Boys.
Right. Yeah.
And the reason that I wouldn't is because, like, I think that it would probably like promote this kind of sort of colorblind participation and non-acknowledgement of what that might mean. And then if I bring it up, then I'm probably going to be accused of introducing things into the art that weren't there. And so it puts me at a disadvantage as an instructor or as a facilitator to use this particular film to try to do that work, or to try to do the work of introducing this band and what they might mean, even if it is just to talk about their story. Because if the only thing that we're going to get is it was Russell's fault,
right?
This would be the same as, you know, like the Eminem story saying, yeah, and Dr. Dre only wanted a white rapper. And you know, there's so much more than that, and a lot of that we want to get from Eminem. We want to know what Eminem thinks about this, because I think that there may be some parallels there, but I don't know. At least I think that it needs to be directly addressed in order to make me feel, you know, better about utilizing it as a space. Again, like it would probably have to be, you know, I haven't read the book either, and we read the book, and then but yeah, no, my classes aren't reading 600-page books.
Right. Yeah.
Are there pictures?
There are a lot of pictures, yeah.
Okay.
So another question that we got, which is a really interesting one, is so one of the things that, obviously, I'll just sort of paraphrase it, but one of the things, you know, later on, particularly MCA became very, very connected to Buddhism and sort of Tibetan religion, and that was like, you know, a big sort of impetus behind the Tibetan freedom concerts and things like that. And he was a pretty committed practitioner of Buddhism for a lot of his adult life. And the film doesn't really go into that. Like, religion doesn't become, and I guess apparently Mike D has also become a pretty active sort of practicing Buddhist, which I didn't know. But yeah, so the question is basically about why we feel like the film didn't spend more time talking about religion, which, like, I guess is true, actually. I mean, it's certainly mentioned, but they don't really spend that much time going into particularly MCA's sort of like pretty deep commitment to his faith and stuff.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Yeah, I wish I had something thoughtful to say about that. I mean, there's also the fact that at least I know Ad Rock is Jewish,
Mhm.
and is practicing Jew. Uh, there's a certain, he always comes up in the discussion of most famous Jewish rappers, along with Drake and a few others.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so they are religiously at least outliers in the hip hop world, at least in the mainstream hip hop world. Yeah, that I mean, retroactively, that is something I would have been interested to hear more about in the documentary.
But also, consider it's a 2-hour film,
Right.
and 2 hours is a lot of time to hear about anybody. Well, no, well, I shouldn't say that. 2 hours is a lot of time, though, for a
A
film.
long time for a movie that you made about yourself.
It is a movie, like very much a movie that you made about yourself, and because of that, then like I think that's the thing that maybe like it brings up the questions. Like I would always like reframe that, like, why do you think they didn't talk more about this?
Mhm.
Because that makes me curious. It really does make me curious if it's such a big part of their of who they are. But I can only imagine, in response to that is that because it's not our music, it's like what we do outside of our music, or it informs our music in some ways, but our music is our music.
Yeah, I would guess too that there was probably a little bit of hesitation on their part, just because it's like, someone's religion is usually a pretty personal thing. And even though MCA was like very, very sort of public about his faith and stuff like that, like I would imagine there's probably a little hesitation on the part of those two guys of wanting to speak too much for someone who's not there about like what their faith meant to them. That person, like, it's probably just sort of like, it seems like a potentially kind of like awkward thing to try to navigate. So we have one more question here, and then I think we're going to be out of time. But the question is, and this is a good one too. Yeah, is this film really a quote unquote documentary, given that it's produced and basically created by the subjects of the documentary, which I think is often, an issue. This is like not, I mean, if anyone watched the Michael Jordan documentary on ESPN, this like this sort of question of like, what does it mean when like basically like very wealthy and powerful and influential people make movies about themselves, like to what degree? And I think it's interesting the point you made, AD, about like, it's not I would like ever teach unless I was like teaching a class. Yeah, so I guess the question is about like, what do we think of documentaries that are basically produced by the people that they're about?
It's a genre of documentary. It's a press kit, and I'll gladly watch a 2-hour press kit about a subject that I'm interested in. Like AD said earlier, the space is there for others to make the alternative documentary from a different viewpoint. It's a genre. It's one of many formats that a documentary can exist in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to, as someone who followed your tweets, Jack, about the Jordan documentary.
I'm not a fan of the Jordan documentary.
That was very clear to everybody. I felt, it's a yeah, for sure it's a documentary, and it's enlightening, and I think that it is like, this film is endearing, and I think that it does something to honor their bandmate, and to inform a public, of some stories that they might not have known about the group. And so I think that all of that is fine. I just don't believe that it's critical in any way. And the ways, like when they are self-critical, I think that those are good things to have as well. I don't think that this is the film that you go to get the deep dive into like the burning questions about like what their existence meant to the times and to the genre and to the world that might have been looking at them for whatever it was that they provided at the times that they did provide it, or what they didn't when they could have.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah.
So I guess one last question that we have, maybe we can tie it off with this, is just a question to everyone of if you have any personal favorite music documentaries, like, or favorite films about music.
I recommend that the 808 documentary.
Yeah, that's great.
Which is I don't know, like that was I don't know. I think that it's dope. Also, another documentary where it seems like who's not there seems to like speak a lot is the Dungeon Family documentary.
Definitely, yeah.
I just felt that in that one I found myself I don't know, like wowed by how much I didn't realize, like things that you like, it's like, oh, that as well. Like I just didn't realize the extent of their contributions. And it's like knowing it, but not just like not being tuned into the fact that it was a thing that, that I was aware of. So those are two, but that's kind of like off the cuff. I'm sure that there are other films that I use with my, Adult Rappers is one that people maybe should check out because I think it's interesting.
I've never seen that. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my answer. It was AD clued me into that film in a conversation we had last year or earlier this year, I suppose. Yeah, it's really fascinating. It zeroes in on the subset of MCs who are not famous and not getting rich, but who make enough off of rap to not have 9-to-5s.
Oh, that's interesting.
So it's that sliver of people who, can perform at a festival like Nine Pillars, for instance, and get a lot of love and get a lot of shine and get a decent paycheck, but then they leave to go to the airport and are treated like everyone else. And it's I think the whole working class hip hop world is one that doesn't get enough publicity or attention or even understanding, because there's still, especially among younger folks, like my high school students, this assumption that everyone who does rap for a living is Drake, is super rich and famous and glamorous. That, and I also saw a film recently about Grant Hart from Husker Du, one of my favorite punk bands, maybe my favorite ever punk band, also told in that Errol Morris style where it's just him reflecting on his career. It's called, oh goodness, I think it's just called Grant Hart, The Man in His Music, and that's on Amazon Prime if anyone wants to check that out. If you like Husker Du or just love punk rock, it's definitely illuminating.
Awesome. Well, these are some great recommendations. So I'm gonna wrap this up now. I want to thank both my panelists profusely for taking part in this, and I also, on behalf of the Virginia Film Festival, in partnership with Nine Pillars Hip Hop Cultural Festival, we would all like to thank you for attending Beyond the Screen, a virtual conversation on Beastie Boys Story today. And again, thanks to AD and Cullen for doing this with me. And finally, you can find a recording of this conversation and others in this series at the Virginia Film Festival's YouTube channel, which I think this is also being live streamed on YouTube right now. So maybe people are already on YouTube. But if you want to watch this again, you can do so on YouTube apparently. So yeah, thanks everyone again for coming. And thanks to my panelists, and have a great rest of your week and stuff.